we're going to do the second. That was chapter 4. No, we're doing this in 2 parts, and this is what it does, the way it works, what it does, how to use it. Got it? Mm-hmm. Good, I got it too. So we're going to finish up the chapter on what it does. It's the 3rd chapter, 2nd part of the introduction to the science of mind, and I think I got that straight, sort of. So as we get started, let's pause for a minute. You know, as we go through this each week, that we open ourselves up and we realize a greater truth, that there is a power and presence for good in the universe. We open ourselves up to that realization, to that understanding of truth. We seek to embody that within ourselves, that we may translate that into our life experience. We are here to express God and to express God maximally, and we come here to this place today to learn more, to grow more, to share more, and to be more in our life. And it's an awesome thought, it's an awesome way of living, and it's an awesome way to experience God as expressing as us and through us. So I give thanks for today. I give thanks for what we're going to share, what we learn. I give thanks for what we're going to take away. We release this to God, and so it is. So it is. Okay, what it does. All right. The way it works, we talked about the thing itself. Mm-hmm. That 1938 is the way that Ernest Holmes framed the concept of God, the thing itself. The way it works was we realized and discovered what he was talking about was us, because the way that God works is by creating and expressing through us, as us in our life experience. But what it does, I didn't really get into last week. I just kind of gave the introduction, because in this whole series that Holmes puts together at the beginning of the Science of Mind, what he's doing is he's introducing people to concepts, and he's allowing people that have gone through this, understand it, and made it part of their life, a way of reviewing to kind of refresh. Because, you know, as life comes at us and through us, we can get a little confused, we get a little sidetracked, coming back to it. So there's 2 ways to read this introduction. One is to read it just through from beginning to end, the first 4 chapters. Another way is to go through it and really detail it out, because as you, almost on a sentence by sentence basis, as you go through and you read it, he's included so much information there that we can take and embody into our life experience. So this year, instead of just taking the 4 weeks going through the 4 chapters, I've really taken time to get into a little more depth. So that's why we split the last 2 chapters, we're splitting them up into 2 Sundays apiece. So I'm going to start back just a little bit. I covered this last week to a certain extent, and it's entitled Love Rules Through Law. When we talk about the divine principle, when we talk about God, one of the words that we use to describe God is love. Now, understanding that love that we're talking about far exceeds most of our understanding when we think about the concept of love, because it's so much more. In fact, it's infinite if we really want to get down to it, right? But in that love is the creativeness of God. But God, you know, it's a funny thing. God gives and God gives always. God creates and God creates always. And so as we go through our experience, we talked about when we talked about being the way it works, that we have to align ourselves with the divine principle if we want to seek to see the demonstration of God's good in our life. God gives always, but God gives us at the level that we understand. And if in our ignorance we are looking out into a material world and we're seeing lack and limitation, we're seeing things of discord, things that we may call evil, God still provides for us those things that we choose to see. Because it's done unto us as we believe, and when we believe it, we will see it. It's not the other way around. When we look out in the world and we see limitation, and we believe that there's limitation in the world, we'll continue to see more. But when we look out into the world and we say, okay, There's stuff going on out there, but it doesn't have to go on. We don't have to see it. We don't have to experience it, because there's an infinite source of all good. And when we open ourselves up and we align ourselves with that concept, that consciousness, it responds in kind. And that's the law part of love ruling through law. That we are held accountable, if you will, not in the sense of a judging God, but in a sense of our own consciousness. That we can provide for ourselves the avenue through which God can create, and create much more abundantly, much more harmoniously, much more prosperity-wise, health. But we have to open the channel up. If we keep the channel closed, then God only can give us good at the level that we keep the channel closed. That's why when the master teacher was walking the face of the earth, he said, "It is done unto us as we believe." And there were some other caveats that he gave with it. And one thing that I cover almost every week is that he also told us that we are to love God with all our hearts, all our minds, all our souls. And he said that is the first and great command. And he said, like unto it is that we are to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And you know, we get kind of lost in that. Because, I mean, let's face it, some of our neighbors are not. You know, I got some neighbors that they could be somebody else's neighbor and I'd be much happier, if you will. But then they may feel the same thing about me also. And that's what we have to understand. That our happiness, our contentment, our harmony has nothing to do with our neighbors, but has everything to do with ourselves. And as we look out into the world and we see discord and we see disharmony, that's still love ruling through law. But the majority of what people see when they look into the world is what they understand through their five senses. And we've talked about that. That evolutionarily, our five senses served us until we got to the level of consciousness. And then when we got to a point, humanity got to a point of consciousness, then a whole new vista opens up for us. We no longer are subject to what the five senses tell us, but we are subject to consciousness, our beliefs. You see, our five senses lie to us. You can look on railroad tracks, and our eyes will tell you that they meet down there in the distance. You can go to the ocean and you look out there and it'll tell you, your eyes will tell you that the world is flat. You can touch something and get burned and your senses will tell you that it's hot when in fact it can be freezing. Okay, we can hear various sounds that we think are one thing which are in fact something else. And we can smell things which we think are something which in fact are not. Which led to a whole industry of sense that and taste that they add to things that are not necessarily good for us to eat, but they smell good or they taste good, right? But the original taste, the natural, which then that led to the whole natural food industry, right? So there's ways that we can find good in that. But our five senses don't tell us what is true in reality. They tell us what we experience on a physical plane. But we know when we look down at those railroad tracks and they come together, we know that they don't. We can likewise know that the rest of our senses don't necessarily tell us the truth. And if we can know those things, then we can make a small leap in consciousness to know that there's something behind it. There's a force, a source, a creativeness that gives us all the good that is. And there was a period of time, starting in about the middle of the 19th century, where something called materialism became very popular within science, and it found a certain home in philosophy and even religion of some sort. And so for a long period of time, that's been kind of the prominent push, but not so much anymore. With the advent of quantum physics and some other things that have been, astrophysics, what they found in the way of what's going on in the universe, they no longer think that maybe it's just all material, that maybe there's some cause, some first cause behind it. Now, we've known that all along, right? In New Thought, we got it. There's one cause. That cause is the source of all good. We claim that, we name it, if you will, and we seek to demonstrate it in our lives. But the rest of the world hasn't necessarily caught up with that, which gives rise to something that I've talked about and I kind of teased on. I'm going to talk about it next month in February this thing called race consciousness. What Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, and the power that it has influencing us in our day-to-day life experience at a level that we're not even aware of. But because I've mentioned it today, you are now aware of it. So as you go through this week, you can refuse to be subject to some of those influences. So that when you see people out there spreading anger, spreading hate, spreading fear, spreading worry, discord, and all this stuff, you can go, you know what? I don't have to be part of that. And when we do that within ourselves, what we are doing is we are creating a greater good within ourselves, but we're also creating a greater world. Okay? So I'm going to take my first break there. Michael, pause that for a second. The law holds us all accountable. It always responds. And how does it respond? It responds to our word. And what is our word? Our word is our thought. The action of consciousness, of God, of spirit, is thought. And in that thought, the law, which is the other side of what we call God, responds and creation takes place. So love rules through law. But because we are God in the micro, as what we think, and the law responds, creation also takes place. And again, it holds us accountable for the way and what we think. Now, I'm going to move on here where I left off last week, and it contains all knowledge is the heading on this section. And Holmes writes, he says, the universal mind contains all knowledge. It is the potential ultimate of all things. To it, all things are possible. It is the potential of all knowledge. To it, all things are possible. And then the next sentence, he says that to us, as much as possible as we can conceive according to law. Should all the wisdom of the universe be poured over us, we should not yet receive only that which we believe. In other words, our good, our perfection, our experience and expression in this life is not limited by God, is not limited by conditions, but it's limited by belief. You remember a couple weeks ago when I talked about that we are all created equal, but we're not necessarily born in equal conditions. Okay, there's various issues that it becomes part of their story. Well, I couldn't achieve because I grew up here, or I was this, or I was that. And in truth, it doesn't make any difference where we are, who we are, or what we are, because God exists within us in potential in all things. In all things we can experience good. In all things we can demonstrate good. Again, at the level that we believe. So this is what we got to know, that knowledge, God contains all knowledge. And one of the things that Holmes writes about, he says, you know, if we happen to be, or if we want to know something, and the only source of knowing that something is like in the middle of Africa, we can still find that information out. We don't have to go to the middle of Africa to get it. We have to open ourselves up to the receiving of it, though. There's stories about when Thomas Edison was doing, he invented quite a few things. But when he was in the process of trying to invent things and he'd run into issues, to obstacles, he would stop, he'd pause. He had a bed or a couch where he'd take a nap. And he'd pose a question to himself. And when he awakened, more times than not, he'd have the answer. Do you know, in business today, one of the techniques that they teach, if you bother to spend the time and the money to go to some of these business seminars, is something just like that. What they tell you to do is right before you go to bed at night, ask yourself the question that you want the answer for. Put a pad and a pencil or a pen next to your bed. And the important thing is that when you wake up in the middle of the night with that answer, you write it down, at least at some level. Because oftentimes if you don't, what happens is you wake up in the morning, you remember getting the answer, but you don't remember what it was. So you write it down. It contains all knowledge and all knowingness. So, moving forward, he says, life always becomes to us. Life always becomes to us the particular thing we need when we believe it becomes the particular thing. In a tragedy, life will come to us in that way because that's what we believe is going to happen. But if we believe that life is going to come to us in love, peace, harmony, wholeness, then that's the way life will unfold. One of the things that I talk about often is that life does come at us at the speed of light, for sure. But when we have aligned ourselves with principle, when we have hooked up with God, if you will, whatever life brings to us, brings at us, no matter what the obstacles may be, no matter what the issues are, we are there and we are able to transcend those issues. We will find the good in the situation and we will move forward and beyond that in a victorious way, if you will. Okay, putting it in purely simplistic human terms. But we can do this. Mm-hmm. We can do this when we take the time. And when I talk about taking the time, I mean each day pausing to reflect. You know, I shared with everybody here that little formula that it just makes kind of life easier for us, that when we take the time each day to meditate, to study, and to pray, we build our faith and belief. And as long as we commit to constantly challenging ourselves for change, we will continue to grow spiritually. We will change and we will see a greater, more abundant good in our life. We'll open ourselves up. Why will we open ourselves up? Because there's that part of us where we hold beliefs very near and dear that oftentimes we're not even aware of. That's called our subjective or subconscious mind. It's a great repository of beliefs, memories, and information that also holds where we go to within ourselves to find our feelings. That's where they exist. That's also where our imagination exists. But that's also where we interact with divine principle on the subjective side. So what we believe, oftentimes we hold beliefs that we're not even aware of, and they sit there in our subconscious mind. Something we learned when we were this big, that you weren't good enough, or you were a bad boy or a bad girl, right? Now, the adult that was telling us that didn't mean that to influence us for the rest of our life. But if we've embodied it at that point in time, it becomes part of our internal belief system. So as we begin to move forward in life, you know, it's like every time you get to that point where you're just going to succeed, you know, it's like the floor drops out from underneath you. You can't explain, why did this happen? Why did so many opportunities come my way and I just couldn't overcome them? And the answer is not out there. Oftentimes many people go out there for the answer. They seek to put blame on something else. But the answer's here. It's within ourselves. Seek within. You know, when the master teacher said, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven. And he said, we can find the kingdom of heaven not out there, but within. When we go to make ourselves more abundant in our life expression, when we go to, as Trower talks about, create more livingness in our life, it's not what the outside can provide for us. It's what the inside has awaiting us. There is within us a potential for all good. And there all things are available to us. Okay, and we move from there through our subjective mind, through our imagination. And if you want to really get a good handle on how to use the imagination, I refer you to Neville. That was his thing. He taught the imagination as the tool and how to use it. And there's a lot of books still in print out there that he published. The next thing is, Holmes tells us mental work is definite. Understanding the definiteness of the concept of mental work is important, because it's not about, gee, I wish I had more in my life. Well, more what? You know, I mean, we can get a lot more of unhappiness. We can get a lot more of limitation. Or we could just as easily get a lot more of relatives moving in that we really don't want to have to support, right? But we can also get a lot more good. So what we want to do is we want to be definite in our mental work. You know, we want to be definite when we begin to engage that thing we call the imagination. We want to be definite when we begin to image the things in our mind that we want to see expressed in our life. We want to be definite as we create the feelings to passionately see those things expressed as if they were already there, okay? And so as we seek to see that mental work is definite, he says, each state of thought taps the same principle, each uses the same law, is inspired by the same spirit, but each draws forth a different result. He says, here is multiplicity proceeding from unity. This is what Emerson meant when he said, unity passes into variety. The potential is there for all things. We have to be definite in those things that we want to seek to express in our life. Another thing we want to do is, in our working on becoming definite, is not to put, a shotgun approach with 50 different things out there that, well, I want to be definite about this, I want to be definite about that, I want to be definite, and all this stuff, and it's like you're scattered. You've taken this great energy and you've kind of spread it out. Find that one thing that you want to work on and start there. And it's an interesting thing as we work on our spiritual journey and we begin to put into practice the tools that we talk about, that as we see demonstrations begin to take place, what happens is not only do we receive the benefit of those demonstrations, but we also receive it's a kind of a feedback thing. If I treat for something, if I'm seeking to see something demonstrate in my life and then it demonstrates, don't just say, well, gee, that's a nice coincidence. Recognize it as a demonstration. Take ownership. Okay, that creates feedback, not only for your conscious mind, but for your subjective, subconscious mind. So the more that we do this, the more that we practice, the more demonstrations we see, and we can start small and we can work larger as we grow spiritually. The more that we see demonstrated, the more that we know this works. The more that we know this works, the more we can choose to embody into our day-to-day life experience. And the more we do this, the more empowered we become in our living experience, the more empowered we become, the more abundantly we live life, and that's our purpose for being here. And that's kind of the way it works. I shared last week, I think, about a book that was written by Harry Emerson Fosdick. And I've talked a little bit about him in the past. He wrote a book, and it's no longer in print, but you can get it out there used. And I believe the title is Understanding the Bible, okay? Now, I can't recommend the entire book as being a great read, but the first part of the book, which I've read, I'm not quite through it, but he talks about God, how the concept of God has evolved. And I found this very interesting as I was reading it because again, Holmes talks about as humanity has evolved, so has our concept of God has evolved. But what Fosdick is talking about is the concept of God as we understand it in the Bible. And so in the Old Testament, a lot of what the Hebrews are writing about there was a God that they believed as like a tribal God of war. Mm-hmm. And he gives a lot of documentation to, so that you can understand how it works out, right? But he brings it up to the point of where the New Testament begins. And he's talking about there's like parallel concepts of God within the Hebrew family. Mm-hmm. One is what the priestly class believes, and the other is what the prophet class believes. And the prophets, they're talking about a God that's more a universal God. They're talking about a God that is more like the God that we kind of got a handle on until you get to the New Testament. And then the God in the New Testament is solely the God that Jesus has brought to the people as an understanding of what God is. Now, it's still kind of evolved along that prophet line, but he shows and he tells how this God was so this understanding of God was so radically different than what the people had believed at that time. Okay, that's part of what got him in trouble, because he was getting a lot of followers, and the priestly class weren't real happy with what he was teaching, this God of love. Because this God of love, as Jesus taught, was not a God of the Hebrews, but was a universal God, was a God of all, that was to be found everywhere. Wasn't the guy on the chair sitting up there. Wasn't a guy that held a list of what you did that was naughty and nice. Wasn't a God that was vindictive, and on and on and on. That concept of God, unsurprisingly, is kind of the way that New Thought understands God to be, everywhere present. Not a God of anger or war, not a God of vengeance or judgment, but a God that's everywhere present. And as I read this, and I'm realizing that he's pretty much talking the New Thought description of God, not even the description of God that you find today necessarily in mainstream theology. which for his day was kind of got him in a little bit of trouble too. But he goes on to explain how that concept of God kind of got buried in dogma and theology. We've talked about this many times in our Sunday lessons that, you know, there's an understanding of God that's always been there since the time of Jesus, but has never been kind of mainstream. And in reality, this is what he's talking about. Okay? When we begin to see how God, the concept of God, has evolved through humanity to today, it just, you know, it's like God speaking to us, you know, wanting to be understood for what it is, so that we can put it into practice. The thing itself, we are the way it works. What it does, and I could have started off last week and done this and just, you know, forgot the class, right? What it does is create. What God does is create. What First Cause does is create. That's what it does. It creates, and it has to continue to create, essentially. Okay? We call it love because in its creatingness, it's a givingness. It's a givingness that has no caveats to it. It will give and it will continue to give, and it will give and give beyond giving. But if you want to call it a caveat, the one thing is that it's love that gives through law, and the law says that if you want to experience the good that I have available to you, you have to align yourself with the good that I have available to you, basically. Okay? When we get into race consciousness in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about how limitation is still expressing in the world today and how we see it and stuff like that. But just know that it doesn't have to be here. And it's only here because people that have failed to understand that they are not apart from, they are not separate from, but there is one great unity, a oneness, a wholeness of which the whole family of humanity is a part of. When you understand that the whole family is what we're a part of, what part of your family are you going to cut out? What part of your family are you going to go to war with? What part of your family are you going to choose to hate because you got a bug in your bonnet that just won't let you go? When are you going to stop seeing things separate? Because ultimately the bottom line is, as you see yourself separate where you can hate or dislike or hold something against somebody else, you've also separated yourself from divine principle. And when we begin to realize that, when we bring ourselves back into the family of humanity, if you will, in consciousness, when we become part of that unity, that oneness, it changes our life. It changes our world, literally. It changes our little world, and it changes the bigger world. And that's why I teach this, why I believe it's so important. And as we understand that mental work is definite, meaning there's no place for us to put aside those little things that, you know, we don't want to let go of because we don't like our neighbor, or, you know, grandma did something against me when I was, you know, that hurt me when I was, and even though grandma's long gone, I still don't like grandma, right? Gotta let it go. That's what forgiveness is about. And he taught forgiveness, that little radical rabbi that walked the face of the earth some 2,000 years ago. And he taught this God. He taught love. And he taught that we are all one. Okay? So, he says, we cannot fight the universe. It refuses to be budged from its course. We can only go with it. You cannot make God do what you want it to do because you want it to do it. It will always do what it's always done. Again, love ruling through law and always being creative. Okay? So the principle restated. He says, let us restate our principle. We are surrounded by an infinite possibility. It is goodness, life, love, law, and reason. In expressing itself through us, it becomes more fully conscious of its own being. Therefore, it wishes to express through us. As it passes into our being, it automatically becomes the law of our lives. It can pass into expression through us only as we consciously allow it to do so. Therefore, we should have faith in it and its desires and its ability to do for us all that we shall ever need to have done. Since it must pass through our consciousness to operate, we must be conscious that it is doing so. If one wishes to demonstrate some particular good, good must become the conscious, or you must become conscious of the particular good. If one wishes to experience it, and therefore we must make our minds up to be receptive to it, and we must do this consciously. There is no hocus pocus in a mental treatment. It is always definite, conscious, concrete, and explicit. We are dealing with intelligence, and we should deal with it intelligently. And here he mentions the word treatment, and I'm going to take a little time today and kind of revisit treatment again. Okay? One of the things that Holmes brought to the New Thought movement was this concept of a 5-step formalized treatment. And the reason why this was kind of a great invention, if you will, is because although, you can study Katie and she talks about doing, prayer, affirmative prayer, you can talk, you read Fillmore's and you can, and the various other New Thought teachers. But when we have the 5 steps, it makes it very simple that anybody can get and understand. Okay? And it's not that any other philosophy is anything less than, it's just this is very simple. So we can embody it easily into our day-to-day life experience. And that first step is recognizing the truth of all that is, that there's one power, one presence that we call God. But that recognition is not between our ears. It is an inner embodiment of the understanding that God is, and God is all there is. Which makes the second step extremely simple, because if God is and God is all there is, then I am within me. Within the I am that is God, that there is a oneness, a unity, that there is no separation. Okay? When I understand that there's a oneness, a unity, that there is no separation, that I am expressing God on a small level, how hard is it to go to that third step where we make the declaration of the good that we want to see in our life? We don't make that declaration in hope. We don't make that declaration as a wish. We make that declaration as if it is already so. Why? Because it's done unto us as we believe. If we believe that we wish for something, we'll get a lot to wish for. If we believe that it is already so, then it's already so. And understanding that God is in potential all things, it is already so on some level. And we can accept that into our lives at the level that we believe that. Which then takes us to the next step, which is the thanksgiving, the gratitude step. How hard is it not to be thankful for that which is? Now, it can be very hard to be thankful for something you wish for because it's not here. You might be thankful that you can wish for it. You might be thankful that maybe it'll show up, but you cannot be thankful that it is here unless you already believe that it's here and you be thankful for that. And that's how gratitude works. And then the last step, we give it up to God. We let go. Now, I talked a little bit, I think, last week about the law of growth that Trower talks about in the Edinburgh lectures. And it's a real nice way to understand it because he says basically there's a law of growth that when we plant a seed within ourselves, it will grow. No doubt about it. God will take over and God will do it. We'll pick up and run with it. But you see, what happens is we oftentimes think that we've got to help God out. Mm-hmm. That maybe God needs a little bit more. Or, on the other hand, we may be worried that God's not up to the task. That I got to help because God can't quite cover the bases, right? And so we want to get our fingers in the pie. We want to go forth and do things that maybe take us in other directions. But what we need to understand about the law of growth is that when we plant the seed, we nurture the seed in faith and belief. We don't nurture the seed in meddling with it. We don't nurture the seed by pulling it up. We don't nurture the seed by planting weeds around it with other thoughts. Because ultimately what we end up doing is we kill the seed. So he says the law of growth is that we give it up to God in faith and belief. And that's the 5th step of treatment. We release it. We let go. We can think of maybe 10 ways to do something. God can think of infinite ways to do exactly the same thing. And we don't know which way it's going to come to us. And if we only limit it to the 10 things that we think of, that may never happen. Because the way that God was going to bring it to us was way number 599,531. if we were thinking of all the different ways. We'd have never got there, but God's already there. So we release it to God. We let it go. We give it up. We take a deep breath in confidence and belief. It's done unto us as we believe. We have to know, we have to live in faith, and we have to get ourselves out of the way. He goes on, he says, the secret already known. In a treatment, there is a statement in the law embodying the concrete idea of our desires and accompanied by an unqualified faith that the law works for us. As we work with it, what we treat for, we already know. In faith, confidence, and belief. We don't worry about it. He says treatment is active, not passive. So what's he talking about when he says treatment is active and not passive? What he means is a treatment is an active thing. When one gives a treatment, he or she is not sitting around hoping that something may happen. He or she is definitely, constructively, actively stating, sensing, knowing some specific good. Actively knowing. Okay, when we treat, we don't put it up on the shelf, although we don't meddle with it. We don't put it up on the shelf. Maybe someone else will take care of it. We actively know already that God's got it done. And when we talk about treatment, this is really key, because oftentimes, you know, we may treat for abundance, we may treat for things in our life, but sometimes when we're treating for things and like we're really behind the 8 ball, right? I mean, we're really concerned that, you know, maybe we don't have money for the mortgage or whatever it is. In treatment, we're talking about it being an active thing. We're talking about getting to that point that we have a knowingness. It's not stating the words. It's not stating that this is so, but within ourselves, we get to that point of knowingness. And the only way I can think of to best kind of illustrate this is when you read about some of the times that Dr. Holmes would do treatment. His treatments weren't 5 minutes long. They weren't 10 minutes long. He didn't have a rote group of words that he said time and time again. His treatment sometimes would go on for hours, multiple hours, until he got to a point of knowingness. I'll give you another understanding of this. Christian Larson, he was an earlier New Thought pioneer. Actually, he taught Holmes some of what Holmes later incorporated into the science of mind. There's several books that Larson has out there, and I highly recommend reading any of them. But in an introduction to one of his books, the author, or the editor, is talking about Larson's son. And his son is sharing some various things that his father did in the way of treatment. You know, there was nothing that went on in the house that, you know, Larson didn't address in that way. But one of the things that he specifically pointed out. Now this is about 1920, probably 22 to 1930, in that time frame there, thereabouts. Now they lived in Hollywood. They lived actually in Beverly Hills. So they're not exactly in a low rent neighborhood. The family dog is diagnosed with rabies. Okay. Now I don't know if there is a treatment for rabies today yet. You know, they can vaccinate you if you've been bitten. Rabies is pretty much a done deal. His son talks about his father going down in the kennel and sat with the dog and treated overnight, all night long. And when his dad came up to the house in the morning, the dog did not have rabies. Now you can take that for what it's worth. But in whenever it was, rabies was pretty easy to diagnose back then. It's not like that there was probably a mistaken diagnosis. And it's not like that, you know, someone came along with a miracle cure at that point, because it wasn't there. But Christian Larson, using what we call New Thought, affirmative prayer treatment, however you want to talk about it, in the demonstration of his treatment was the complete wholeness of the family dog. There was nothing to be healed, only truth to be revealed, to quote Eric Butterworth. Okay? It's a pretty awesome story. But you know, there's a lot of other stories just like that. What you have to do as you seek to do treatment in your life, whether it be for an extra couple bucks at the end of the month, or maybe grandkids. I know some grandmothers or some potential grandmothers that would like to have grandkids, right? But the thing is, you treat until you get to that point of completion. You've got to know, and know that you know, not hope, not think maybe. So, okay, it's going to take you a couple hours. Maybe you got to revisit it. You go back. But you get to that point of knowing, and that point of knowing is available to each and every one of us, because that's part of that God, that Christ within us. It's there in potential. We can reach it. We can get to it. Because what it does is create. And as we see creation, we call that demonstration in our lives. Okay? That's what it does. So the thing itself is God. The way it works is us. What it does is it creates. And we can direct its creative force in our life. Because that's the gift that's given to us. What do we have time with? I don't know where I'm at.
11:17.
Okay, I'm almost done. So we'll wrap it up here for today. Next week, we're going to start the first half of how to use it. How to use it. We're talking about how to use divine principle, or how to use God. How to put God to use into your life. How to use it. Okay? So, in closing, I got most of it covered. Pretty much covered that. In just this last segment here, he says, there's no limit to thought. When we think, something happens to thought. The field through which thought operates is infinite. There is no reason to doubt it, no matter how it is approached. To thought, there can be no limit. So we will say that it is the nature of being to react in this way. Here and now, we are surrounded by, immersed in, an infinite good. How much of this infinite good is ours? All of it. How much of it may we have to use? As much as we can embody. As you go through this week, think about the things we talked about the last couple of weeks. I urge you to take time each and every day. Pause, meditate, study a little bit, and treat for yourself. We're all practitioners in our own way, and we can all do it. And taking that time, we can make the choice that we are important enough in our own day-to-day life experience to take that time. And start out with 5 minutes. Maybe the 5 will go to 10, maybe it'll be more, maybe 5 minutes will be enough for you. For each of us, it's different, but for each of us, it is available. Claim it today. Make it a part of your day-to-day life experience. You are on a spiritual journey of self-discovery and self-creation. That's the gift that God gave to each and every one of us. And so it is.
And so it is.
Thank you.